talk about the generic nature of disease. In other words, how it's not all a bunch of different health issues. You don't have a brain problem and a liver problem and a bone problem and problems in all the various organs. All that does is just create specialties and specialists and raises a whole bunch of confusion. What I like to talk about when I talk about the bright side philosophy is simplicity. I'm making it simple so that you can do things at home. If you have to go to a doctor, you have to go to even a naturopath, or you have to go to some kind of health authority to tell you about your body, you're missing something. So I read an article. I love collecting these articles. I got this article here yesterday, or a couple days ago. This is from Science Signaling. We've been talking about Alzheimer's disease on my program. And I've been saying this for years. Alzheimer's disease is osteoporosis of the brain, arthritis of the brain. Name your disease, it's of the brain. It's a degenerative disease of the brain. The last couple years, doctors or medical professionals, not necessarily doctors, but medical researchers have been calling Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes. Have you heard this?
Yes.
Actually, because they see that there's all the same all the same symptoms that happen with diabetes: dysglycemia, messed up blood sugar, problems with gut bacteria. These are all linked to Alzheimer's disease. So they now have classified Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes. So last week I was reading, this is from a journal called Science and Signaling. Atherosclerosis is Alzheimer's disease of the blood vessels. So that the same thing that happened when you have clogged up blood vessels happens when you have Alzheimer's disease. And this just highlights the idea that the body breaks down generically. Things clog up. Blood vessels or blood gets coagulated and clogged so it doesn't deliver oxygen correctly. Inflammatory factors accrue. Calcium and plaques start to develop. Fibers start to be secreted. This happens no matter what your disease is. There are mechanisms that are generic that underlie all chronic degenerative diseases. So what this implies is that the causes of all chronic degenerative diseases are pretty much the same. Whether it shows up in the brain or whether it shows up in the bone or whether it shows up in the liver or the skin or anywhere else in the body, you're dealing with most critically, and not only most critically, but most powerfully when it comes to us taking control of our health. What you're dealing with underneath all chronic degenerative disease is this word that we bandy about, we throw around very glibly in our day-to-day life. It's called inflammation. All right? Now, you're a smart guy, Jonty, right? I've known you now for going on 10 years or so, probably, right? You're a smart guy. But if I were to ask you what exactly inflammation was, even though you probably heard the word 1,000 times, unless you were really studying it or unless you were really hip to it, you paid attention to biochemistry, you wouldn't be able to tell me exactly what inflammation is. We hear this all the time, inflammation, right? Anti-inflammation, inflammation behind disease. It's caused by inflammation. There's a commercial now where for a drug for Crohn's disease or celiac disease, they say, we now know the cause of celiac disease. It's inflammation. Ooh, inflammation, right? So what is this mysterious thing, inflammation? All you got to know about inflammation is it's a protective mechanism. It's your airbag. It's your biochemical airbag. It's a way the body protects itself from invaders. And by the way, broken down cells are considered invaders. So that when a cell is deformed and it looks foreign to the body perceives it as being some kind of foreign agent. Food is a foreign agent. That's why it has to be digested. If food is not digested properly and little particles, undigested particles, leak into the blood, that gets perceived as an invader. When cells break, if there's some kind of mechanical trauma, if you get hit by a car or something drops on your head, the cells become deformed, the cells break, that becomes some kind of perceived by the body as some kind of invader. All of these will initiate an inflammatory response. So step number 1, behind all chronic degenerative disease, you have an inflammatory response. Step number 2, behind all inflammatory responses, you have defense. Follow? So you've got inflammation that underlies every chronic degenerative disease. Every one of them, Jonty. That means behind every chronic degenerative disease, you have some kind of defense going on, an airbag deployment. I like that strategy, or I like that metaphor of an airbag, because it tells you that the body is walling off an area. That's what inflammation is. It's like a wall, a beaver's dam. Now, if it happens once in a while, that's not a problem. The inflammatory process is normal. It happens all the time. But where we run into issues is when it's chronic, when you have lots of beavers dams, lots of airbags deploying, lots of barricades, because when when part of the body is barricaded off, oxygen can't get through, nutrients can't get through, toxins can't leave. So now you have this little patch, this little beaver's dam that is starving, that is suffocating, and that is accumulating toxicity. So you have this little pocket of death, essentially. Now, if it happens again, if it happens once in a while, that's not a big issue. But where we run into problems is where the body is chronically attacked over and over and over again. What ends up happening is you get these little pockets of inflammation, these little pockets of death, these little pockets of starvation, suffocation, intoxication. Happens once, twice, 3 times, 10 times, 100 times. Okay, the body can deal with it, but over the course of years and decades and the course of a lifetime, eventually you've got massive areas in the body that aren't getting fed, that aren't getting oxygen, and that are swimming in their own poison. You can't help but have a disease at that point. Here's where it really becomes tricky, however. We don't notice it until it's big. See, when I talk about inflammation, there's actually 2 kinds of inflammation. Most of us, when we think about inflammation, we think about a black eye or swelling if you twist your ankle or break a bone. That's inflammation. Everybody knows that. But what's not recognized is that same process occurs microscopically. That's called microinflammation. It's the same process, but it's happening at the teeny tiny levels of a cell, the microscopic invisible levels of the cell. And again, if it happens once in a while, not a big deal. It can happen a lot, really, and it's not a big deal. It's just when it's chronic. So underneath, the generic mechanism that is underneath all chronic degenerative disease is long-term, day-to-day, hour-to-hour sometimes, attack. And the subsequent the body's subsequent defensive response, the inflammatory response. So logic tells you see how we're working here. We'll just use Alzheimer's disease as an example. You've got Alzheimer's disease, which, all researchers of Alzheimer's disease will tell you there's fibers that are present, there are plaques that are present. These are all the hallmark signs of inflammation: fibers and plaques and thickness and things being clogged up, blood not moving through the vessels appropriately, accumulation of waste, accumulation of acidity, accumulation of sugar. This is all happening at the area where the Alzheimer's disease is occurring, and researchers understand this. So we're going to use Alzheimer's disease as an example. Alzheimer's disease, as the quintessential example of a chronic degenerative disease, is the manifestation of a defensive response that's occurring over and over and over again in that area of the brain. Logic would tell you, and this is all logical here, if you have a chronic long-term defensive response that you want to end, you got a chronic long-term defensive response that's causing you grief, causing you problems. If it's in the brain, it's causing you Alzheimer's disease. If it's in the bone, it's causing osteoporosis or wherever. And it's a defensive response. What does logic tell you the solution would be if you want it to end?
You want to remove whatever's causing the
Exactly. It's as simple as that. Now, there's a little bit of a wrinkle here, because if you're nutritionally deficient, if you're missing key nutrients that support the body's ability to repair itself, this inflammatory response, this defensive response will be amplified. It'll be even worse. So it's a combination of figuring out what the heck is the body defending itself from, what is getting into the body, and this is all chronic degenerative disease, Jonty, 80% of our health misery. Figuring out what is getting into the body that's causing this defensive response, and then supporting the body's ability to protect itself and to repair. That's how you deal with all chronic degenerative disease. And I keep saying all because I want us to understand that it doesn't matter whether it's in the brain or it's in the bone or it's in the skin or it's in the liver or it's in the lungs or it's in the heart or wherever it is, which means you don't need a specialist, which means you don't even need a doctor, really. What it means is you've got to figure out, what am I putting into my body on a regular basis, and how can I strengthen my body and give my body what it needs so that it can repair and grow and fight whatever it has to fight off. So number one, what's getting into my body? How do things get into the body? Well, you can inject them. That's conceivable. And we do know that people who are IV drug users, or even people sometimes who get kids or adults even who get vaccines, these can cause problems because stuff is now getting into the blood and the body has to protect itself. But aside from that, because most people aren't IV drug users and vaccines do occur a lot, but that could be a significant problem. But when people have a vaccination, they only have vaccinations once a year or once every few years. What do we do on a regular basis to introduce the outside world into the inside world?
We eat.
We eat. Exactly. And I always have to say this because it's not like I'm a food Nazi. It's not like I'm sitting here, Mr. Eat Right, Gary Null type of thing where you got to eat right and you got to eat all your veggies. And it's true, you do have to do all that, but I don't like beating people up for their food. I'm just saying logic. Logic alone tells you if you have a defensive response and you have an offending agent to the body and you're trying to assess what that offending agent is, the greatest likelihood in the world, the greatest likelihood is going to be that that offending agent is coming in through your mouth. It's something that you're eating. Now, this is theory. If you want to apply the theory, fast. Stop eating. Eat for a day. Stop eating for a day. Fast for a day. And if you do your research, and you don't even have to do this yourself, just do the research on the internet, you'll see that almost all symptoms of chronic degenerative diseases, the pain, the inflammation, the fluid accumulation, whatever it is, they will all begin to subside when you stop eating. In fact, there's a wonderful study that's on WebMD that talks about multiple sclerosis, MS, an autoimmune disease, where the symptoms of MS subside when patients fast. And this is on WebMD's website, which, as you know, is not, they're no friend of alternative medicine. But even the conventional wisdom in the medical model is when you stop eating, you feel better. Why would that be? Because every time you eat, the body has to defend itself from something. And that's if you eat good. That's if you eat well. That's if you eat spinach and salads and you don't eat anything crappy. Your body is still going to mount an inflammatory response. It's called postprandial inflammation or postprandial leukocytosis, which means after you eat, you get a bunch of white blood cells. Or after you eat, you get a defensive response, an inflammatory response. Now, this is any food, but certainly if you eat the standard American diet, if you subsist on the standard American diet, it's almost impossible to avoid an inflammatory response and sometimes a major inflammatory response. Now, this isn't a big deal for somebody who's not dealing with a health challenge necessarily. You may not even notice it necessarily. But if you are dealing with Alzheimer's disease or an autoimmune disease or a bone disease or a liver issue or any kind of inflammatory, degenerative, long-term kind of progressive disease state, you will find that when you stop eating, when you fast, you feel better. Now, obviously, you can't stop eating forever. You have to eat something, but it will just be a demonstration. It will just be show you how powerful eating behavior is when it comes to seemingly disconnected symptomology. I mean, it's your brain after all. Why would it have anything? Why would the hamburger I ate yesterday have anything to do with my Alzheimer's disease today? There's a disconnect there. But when you fast and when you start to notice your body's response to specific foods, and this is why food diary can be very helpful, you can see the relationship, you can see the connection between the two. The beauty of this model is it frees us from medicine. It frees us from the standard way that we treat disease, which is where we go somewhere else and ask some other authority to help us, some outside authority to help us. This allows us to be independent of the medical model. The simplicity of this is so powerful and so effective that we can do it from the comfort of our own kitchens and living rooms. And that's why it's so important to recognize the generic nature of all chronic degenerative diseases, no matter where those diseases are showing up.